For those of us who know the history of Kemet, we know that obelisk is actually a Tekken, and that Tekken represents the resurrection of Asar. Asar is the founding father of ancient Kemet, and that Tekken represents the oldest symbol of resurrection known to mankind. It is over 6,000 years old, at least 4,000 years older than this other person who was resurrected.
Kemetologist, archaeologist, historian, cultural memory specialist, director of the IKG, my good friend, Anthony Browder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Garcia. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon's interview.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a minute, so it's good to see you.
Absolutely.
One thing I wanted to share with you right off the bat is you talk about having a metamorphosis. And I wanted to share something with you that I didn't get to share with you when we first arrived in Africa. And the minute we landed on an airplane, we just hit the ground. I heard a lady and she was crying with joy. And it was so profound in me because I felt healing going on in her. And she says, "I'm home." And she says, "I'm home." And she was crying. And when I first heard that, I was like, oh shit, because I felt a shift in me. I felt a shift in me where I felt healing within myself, and I felt the healing in her, like it was within me. And it was so profound that I was about to cry, and I got teary-eyed, and I changed the subject in my mind because I don't want to see people see me crying. But I felt a healing going on in me as well. And being a Mexican guy that grew up in San Pedro, California, and Los Angeles area, like, how does that even happen? And I realized that we're all connected. You know, none of us are fully healed until all of us are healed, in my opinion. And it was very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. It brings to mind two things. Ray Charles has a song, "None of Us Are Free Until All of Us Are Free." And it speaks to what you just said. And your response to the sisters' tears of joy upon landing in Egypt has to do with resonance, right? We are all connected, as you said. And the energy, everyone has energy. And our energy resonates with like-minded people. So when, you can see somebody for the first time and all of a sudden you get a vibe, you like them. Or there's something about them that makes you distrustful of that person, right? It's because the energy that person emanates, and either your energy resonates with that person and you're drawn to them, or there's a dissonance and you repel from them. So as human beings, we all are energy centered creatures, right? And we all feel the same desires, the same interests, and the same pain. And when we know that, we can come together for our individual and collective healings. And the reverse of that is also true. If we are filled with what we refer in Kemet as Setian energy, that lower vibrational frequency, then we can also draw people to us of a lower consciousness. And when you amplify that collective lower consciousness, then it spreads evil and confusion and hatred over a very broad area. So you mentioned the phrase, your metamorphosis began when you touched down. Now, I think some of your listeners may not be aware of that term. So let me clarify that for your audience. Metamorphosis is a term that a friend of mine who traveled to Egypt with us in 2000 coined upon returning from her first trip to Egypt on one of our study tours. And Kemet is the original name for the country that the Greeks called Egypt. And this woman went to work. She works for, she's a big time official in the post office, right? And she goes back to work, and her colleagues are telling her, girl, you've changed. ever since you came back from Egypt, you're different. And she said, yeah, I went to Kemet and I had a metamorphosis, right? So we've
Mm.
been using that term ever since to describe the soulful transformation of consciousness that takes place in the minds and hearts of people who come to that space with their minds attuned to realigning themselves to the history, to the culture, to the ancestral spirits that are there waiting for us to remember them. So I'm glad you had your metamorphosis at the beginning of the trip. And by the end of that trip, brother, everybody was feeling it. Everybody was vibing. Mm-hmm.
You're right about that.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The Kemetic concepts of spiritual beingness. What does that mean?
Well, one of the things that I have been talking about, or learning about, talking about, and writing about now for over 43 years has to do with the rediscovery of the knowledge and history of ancient Africa. And part of that rediscovering is the restoration of the original names of people, places, and things. So as I mentioned previously, Kemet is the original name for the country that the Greeks renamed Egypt. Mir is the original name for the building that the Greeks renamed Pyramid. Hieroglyphics is the original name of the statue that the Greeks renamed the Sphinx. So, coming from Mexico, you know yourself that the names that indigenous people give to people, places, and things are quite different than the names that explorers and discoverers and enslavers use when they rename those same people, places, and things. So names have energy, have power. And when you call someone out of their name, it is a profound sense of disrespect. So in my research of the history of ancient Kemet, which is in Africa, Egypt is in Africa, and Kemet is an extension of Nile Valley culture and civilization. The Nile River Valley is over 4,100 miles long. And we can't talk about Kemet without talking about its connection to Kush, modern day Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, which are all part of the Nile River Basin. So when we look at that culture, Nile Valley culture, we're looking at the oldest continuously documented civilization of any people on the planet. We have in excess of 3,000 years of unbroken, um, continuous um, transformation of knowledge from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next for over 3,000 years. So what I have found in my study of Kemet is the essence of Kemetic or Nile Valley contributions to civilization in the form of architecture, writing, history, government, and religion. So we can trace the origins of the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, back to the Nile Valley. And when we do that, what we will discover is that there is a profound difference between the spiritual traditions that were practiced in the Nile Valley and the religions that foreigners or strangers extracted from the limited time that they may have spent in the Nile Valley. So prior to people of the Jewish persuasion having a religion, they came into Kemet, they saw or experienced some of the spiritual traditions that were in place, and then they went home and established the Jewish traditions, which are a reflection of a small part of the spiritual traditions that began in the Nile Valley. One can do the same thing in tracing the origins of Christianity and Islam. So what I know from my own personal experiences is that these religions represent less than 1/10 of the spiritual practices that were developed in the Nile Valley thousands of years before they came into existence. So the restoration, the understanding and restoration of these spiritual traditions is a crucial step that one must engage in if they wish to restore their minds and to develop a more meaningful relationship with the source, with the creator, with God, Allah, Jehovah, whatever term you want to use to identify that source, that one source, which has been known by many different names by different people all over the planet.
Speaking of that, I had a question for you. Moses, isn't mentioned Moses in Egypt in the hieroglyphs? And what are the original name for the hieroglyphs? I was just wondering.
Well, no. Those are two good questions. And let me start with your last question first. Hieroglyphics is a Greek word. Hiero means sacred. Hiero means sacred. And glyphs means writing or carving. So hieroglyphics makes reference to the sacred carvings which the Greeks found carved on the temples or the papyri and other structures in Kemet. The original name, the original African name for the writing, the language is Medu Neter. Medu means writing. Neter comes from the word neter, which means principles or aspects of the divine. And so Medu Neter is either the writing or the words that were spoken by those sources closest to creation. God's words, if you will, if we can reinterpret it through the English language, the words of God, the words of the Creator, is what this language actually represents. And I forgot the first part of your question. What was the first part of your question?
Moses. When we were in Egypt, I was asking around about Moses.
Okay, so Moses is a Kemetic word. Just as the word Amos that we find in the Bible is a Kemetic word. The word Moses comes from the Kemetic word, which means saved from the waters. We have many kings and other personalities with the name Moses. We have Tutmosis the first, Tutmos the second, Amos the first, Amos the second, and it's from the Kemetic word Amos that we have derived the word Amos. So what we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, that many of the names that are in the Bible and the Torah were names that were derived from original Kemetic names that were reinterpreted by strangers who then used these names to describe relationships, stories, and myths, which helped to elevate these people and give them a God concept, which allowed them to be able to find their way in the world and compete against other organizations and other nations in the world, because they had grounded themselves in a God concept which benefited them. And to that same point, let me stress this point, that what we find in the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those are primarily male-oriented religions. What they got wrong when they took the knowledge of the spiritual traditions from Kemet back to their own homeland, what they got wrong was they omitted the feminine complement of creation. In Kemet, you have the expressions of creation, which were referred to as Netcher, Netcher. And it is from the word Netcher that we have derived the word nature in our language. So there were Netcher associated with every aspect of beingness, the soil, rocks, trees, plants, the air, the water. And every Netcher was created with in complementary pairs, male and female. So there was a nature associated with the sun, a nature associated with water, a nature associated with the rising sun, the hidden sun, and so every nature had its masculine and feminine counterpart, which represented what the people in the Nile Valley referred to as ma'at, harmony and balance between the two masculine and feminine forces that exist within the universe. So the reality is, when others came into Kemet, extracted elements of their spiritual traditions which they could understand, and then use that knowledge to create religious systems, which they use to subject their people to. These systems were codified by men, and what they did was to project an image of God as male, and they suppressed the image of the goddess because, according to their traditions, women were the source of man's fall from grace. It was, the whole Adam and Eve myth. And I have to stress that as a myth because all of the stories in the religious texts are myths. They're not true, but they contain truth. They contain lessons of profound historical, cultural, and religious importance. But the key is to know the difference between the literal interpretation of these texts and the symbolic or metaphorical interpretation that is inferred in the lessons. Most people, unfortunately, believe that in the literal word of the Bible, for example, the literal word of God, and they don't know that the book known as the Bible is a book comprised of 66 different chapters written by 66 different people over a period of 2,000 years. It's not, one person who sat down and wrote the Bible, and the people who were responsible for writing the Bible were not necessarily men who were inspired by God, because there's a lot of wickedness in the Bible. There's a lot of murder and a lot of violence in the Bible, which has been used as a means of subjugating and controlling people through fear and ignorance. So my belief has been that knowledge cancels out ignorance. Knowledge cancels out fear. And I've been on a quest to access as much truthful knowledge about the history of Africa, about the history of the world, and then sharing that with people who matter to me.
I love when you mention Dick Gregory, and you were in college, and he talked about King James, and he said King James made Hitler look like Santa Claus.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Most people, the King James Bible is the most popular book in the world. Most people do not know who King James was. Most people don't understand why King James authorized a specific version of the Bible. Most people don't know that there are over 300 different versions of the Bible, and that a version means a change in form or substance. So if the Bible is the inherent word of God, then why are there all these different versions of this one original text? So numerous people have authorized the writing of a Bible in order to advance their own political and social needs. King James was one of these people. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in wanting to know more about that book to do a little research on the history of King James. And to Dick Gregory's credit, he was absolutely correct when he said that King James is a man who would make Adolf Hitler look like Santa Claus.
I recently went back to school, and I had a professor tell me off in school, in class, in the middle of class. He told me off in front of everybody. I had a religious professor and a philosopher get pissed off at me in class. They asked us questions, and he asked the question, when he was getting to Judaism, he talked about Moses, and he's finally monotheism, and he's kind of making fun of everyone else, these pagans and whatever. And I says, what about Akhenaten? And he looked at me, and he didn't know how to answer anything, so he got frustrated, and so he told me off in front of the class.
Well, look, Garcia, let me share this with you. When you're in class, you're in somebody else's space. And the purpose of going to class is to get a grade that will help advance your career through life. So I learned this when I was in school, that schools don't teach you the truth. Schools are all about indoctrination. And teachers are there in order to oversee the indoctrination process. Is one of the other things that D. Gregory said. You know, he used to. I graduated from Howard University here in Washington D.C., and D. Gregory would come to Howard at least once a year to do an address before the student body. And another thing that he said that impacted me is that schools teach you how to make a living, but they don't teach you how to live. The whole purpose of school is to prepare you to go into the workforce and work for someone else, to give you, basic math skills and reading skills so that you will be a benefit to a future employer. Schools don't teach you how to think and process information. So my advice to people in your situation who are in the classroom, do the work, pass the test, get the A, get out the class, and then do your thing. Don't argue with the teacher, because most times the teachers don't know the information themselves. And when you embarrass them, their fragile egos may cause them to lash out at you, and that could be reflected in a failing grade.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way. Speaking of that, the Ankh, what does the Ankh mean? Because it looks like the cross, the Christian cross, right?
Do you have an Ankh on your shirt? I'm looking at your shirt. I see the loop. Yes, you do. Truth. Okay. All right. So the T on your shirt is an Ankh. The Ankh is the ancient Kemetic symbol of a life. It is a symbol that represents the life force flowing through a person. You'll find many scenes carved on temples or written on papyri where you see a person hold an Ankh to a person. And usually the Ankh is held to the nostrils of an individual. And what it represents is giving that person life. We breathe air through our nostrils. And in the Latin tradition, breath was known as spirit. So spirit, God, energy, the life force enters your nostrils when you breathe, which is the reason why when someone sneezes, they expel the air from their body quite quickly. And you say, God bless you, as a means of the God or the creator now infusing that air back into your body so that you can live again. But the Ankh is a symbol that represents life. It is, as is the case with most symbols have at least 7 different meanings. And one has to do a deep dive into understanding the various levels of each symbols so that you aren't confused and just take them literally. So the Ankh is a symbol of life. The Ankh is also a symbol that represents the union of the masculine and feminine forces of creation, which brings life into existence. The top part of the Ankh, the oval, represents the womb. The bottom part of the Ankh represents a phallus, or the penis. And what you have is the insertion of the penis into the womb, which gives life, which is represented by the horizontal bar. So it brings life into existence. It also symbolizes the Trinity, the masculine and feminine forces of creation, and the offspring that comes from that union. So that when Christians, for example, came into Kemet and appropriated aspects of Kemetic spirituality, they took the Ankh and closed the top portion of the Ankh, which represents the feminine principle. So they literally obliterated the feminine aspect of creation, or the feminine aspect of God. And when you close the top portion of the Ankh, then what you have is the cross. And the cross symbolizes the death of Jesus, or the Son of God, and reinforces this idea, this concept of Christianity as a male-oriented, male-dominated religion, which means that it has lost at least 50% of its soul.
Wow. And the Gnostic Christians, didn't they come off of Egypt's teachings? And I know they still carry the Ankh in some ways. And they also talked about Sophia, the feminine.
Sure. Well, Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And what the Gnostics did, and Gnostic is a word which means to know, people who were seeking knowledge. So after the fall of Kemet, you had, after the fall of Kemet and the establishment of Christianity, you had Roman Christian um, emperors suppress the so-called pagan teachings or pagan religion of Kemet. And, it's important to note that the word pagan simply means someone whose religious beliefs are other than your own. A pagan religion is not good or bad. It just means it's different than your own. So it's not a word to be ashamed of. And what they did was, because of the fact that the elements of Christianity, Jesus the Christ, the Immaculate Conception, the virgin birth, all of these elements of Jesus were taken specifically from the Nile Valley story of Asar, Aset, and Heru. It's the same story, just rewritten through a different cultural lens. And what these Roman emperors did after they had appropriated the spiritual traditions of Kemet and created Christianity, they then needed to destroy the original evidence. And so it was Constantine, it was Theodosius, and then Justinian in the 6th century AD, who finally succeeded in closing down all of the ancient temples in Kemet, forbidding the writing of Medu Neter. And so the ability for people to read these sacred texts was lost for 1,300 years. But there were people who still understood the value of what existed in Kemet. And some of these people were Greeks, some of them were Romans, and they were known as Gnostics. They were known as people who were seekers of knowledge, seekers of the truth. And they, as best they could, tried to revive some of these ancient traditions, many of which were now deemed outlawed by the governments and religious institutions at the time. So they literally had to go underground. But as you read about these organizations, these so-called secret societies, they weren't necessarily secret societies. They were, in fact, societies with secrets. And they were forced to go underground for their own physical protection and, more importantly, the protection of this knowledge that these governments sought to suppress. Because the essence of it is, brother, and I'll share this with you, and I don't want to get too deep on this, but the essence of it is that if we study, Nile Valley civilization in general, West African civilization and spiritual traditions as a whole, we find that there is no death. That there is this thing that was referred to as the Rehemi Mesu, or the repetition of the birth. The body is temporary, but the soul is eternal. And the soul is animated by the spirit, and the animated soul within a body allows this body to live a certain quality of life. But when the body is exhausted, the soul then returns to this space, and there's different names for this space where the soul goes to, and it evaluates its life. And then based on that evaluation, it prepares to be reborn in a new life where the process begins again. And so there is this idea, this concept that many cultures hold of the repetition of the birth or reincarnation. What religions did was to suppress that information and then propagate this false belief, one, that you were born in sin, and two, the Son of God died for your sins. And by believing and worshiping the Son of God, you can get your reward in the afterlife. So this idea that you only go around once in life and that you were born in sin is antithetical to the spiritual teachings that have dominated cultures around the world for thousands and thousands of years. And I think, you would probably agree, if you look at what's happening in the world, many people are beginning to reject these ancient religions, which were used to justify slavery, justify conquest and domination of indigenous people all around the planet. So one has to be honest with themselves and acknowledge that Judaism and Christianity, Christianity and Islam specifically, have been used to conquer and destroy more people than they will ever save. And that's just a historical fact.
No, I believe you. And going back to there's no death. I always say death is a creation of the mind, because in my own experience, I've had some experiences where I realized like I was not this body, like I'm deeper than that, and who I really am doesn't die. That's why, like in the Hindu
Mm-hmm.
tradition, they talk about the self with the capital S, and I really believe like be still and know I am God. That's my true essence. And how can you
Mm-hmm.
kill God? So be still and know the deathless self, because who I really am cannot die.
Mm-hmm.
One time, I
Mm-hmm.
had a couple pastors starting to preach to me. I was in a line for a rental car at the airport, and I asked them a question because they asked me if I believe. And this ain't no disrespect to anybody's beliefs, but
Sure.
I'm just if someone's going to tell me something, I'm going to look into something. And so they
Mm-hmm.
asked me if I believe Jesus was my Lord and Savior, and I said, before I answer that question, can I ask you a question? And they said, sure. I go, do you believe Jesus was God? They said, well, absolutely. He said, I and my Father are one. I says, well, how could God die? And they couldn't answer. Oh, because he came in a body. No, but how could God die? Who you really are is deathless. Be still and know the deathless self. And I shook their hands and I walked away. But that's been
Mm-hmm.
my
Well,
experience.
well, look, I applaud you for that. And at the same time, I want you to understand that religion is a business. And this particular business is predicated upon teaching people to believe um, some fundamental lies. And there's no other way to say it. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. They teach you that you were born in sin. That's a lie. That's a lie. They teach you that the Son of God had to die for your sins, and that by believing in the Son of God, you will be rewarded in the afterlife. So you can be a thief, you can be a murderer all your life, but if you accept Jesus Christ on your deathbed, it means that all of your sins are forgiven, and you'll go to heaven and be reborn. Now, I don't know anybody that can validate the existence of heaven. And for those who know and understand, the greater reality is that, and I would preface it this way: I am not God, but the essence of God, the essence of the Creator, dwells within me. And I have the capacity as a human being um, who has a soul and a spirit that works through me. I have the capacity to be like a creator and create here on earth. So the question is, what do I choose to create? Do I choose to create a better quality of life for myself and my family, or do I choose to destroy? We have to make those choices. And whatever we do, whatever choice we make, determines not only the quality of life that we live in this life, but the quality of life we will live in every life after this one. So imagine, if you will, if people were taught this information from the day that they were born, and welcome you back as an old soul in a new body, right? And help to restore your memory of who you were in your previous lifetime, what you did in the previous lifetime, and then helped you continue your journey through this lifetime. We would have a totally different quality of life. We would have a totally different world. But again, unfortunately, given the circumstances that we were born into, um, that does not exist. But we still have the capacity to access this ancient information. And for those of us who choose to study and apply this knowledge in our lives, we can experience a different quality of life. And, my philosophy is, brother, that I don't impose my beliefs, my thoughts on others. I don't have the right. Everyone has the right to believe what they want to believe. And a belief is something you accept without proof. I live my life knowing that knowledge reigns supreme, right? ARS, knowledge reigns
Yeah.
supreme. And that with the access of knowledge, that we have the capacity to live up to our true potential as creators in a physical body. So the question then is accepting responsibility for being a creator, learning how to create things that will sustain you and will continue to exist after you're no longer here, so that the world can reap the benefits of you having contributed to the great march of humanity. And that to me is what life is all about. And if you can't do that, if you don't know that, if you can't do that, then you're simply wasting air.
Yeah, thank you. Speaking about going back to school, when I took my philosophy class, I asked them because they got right into the Greeks and they got right into the Romans. And I said, well, what happened to Egypt? Mentioned nothing about Egypt. What's the importance of understanding true history, and how does that create division, racism, and discrimination if we just rob African history from humanity?
Sure. That's an excellent question, my friend. Um, what I know, not what I believe, not what I think, what I know based on study, based on science. And the word science is derived from the Latin root word, which means to know. So science is all about the acquisition of knowledge, which expands your capacity to know more and to move through this world successfully. So what I know is that human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, have lived on this planet at least 300,000 years based on the latest anthropological and archaeological evidence. We know this for a fact. We also know that humanity, Homo sapiens sapiens, began in Northeast Africa. That's already been documented. I've been to Ethiopia. I've seen the bones of Dekkenish, so-called Lucy. I've seen the bones of Artie, who is the oldest bones of Homo sapiens sapiens known to man. We also know that people in Northeast Africa began walking out of Africa around 60,000 years ago and walked across the land bridge that connected Africa to Asia and began populating Asia. That's a scientifically documented fact. We also know that approximately 40,000 years ago, another group of people in East Africa walked into Western Asia, the landmass that is now referred to as Europe. So if you just process those those three pieces of information: one, humanity began in Africa 300,000 years ago. Two, Africans began populating Asia 60,000 years ago, which means the first people in Asia were not Asians, but Africans. Three, Africans populated Europe 40,000 years ago, which means that the first people in Europe were not Europeans, but African. We also understand that through a process of speciation, adaptation to climatic environments, those Africans in Asia and Europe began to change their skin color. They began to lose their melanin as they move further and further away from the equator. Their facial features changed, their hair texture changed, their eye colors changed, and they eventually became the other so-called races that populate the planet. And we also know, based on scientific evidence, that there is no such thing as race. There's only one race, which is the human race, which had its origins in Africa. And regardless as to what continent or country you live on this planet, all human beings have a DNA that's 99.9% the same, identical. So if you were to strip away, this meat suit that we're wearing and look at our innards, look at our blood, look at our cells, you'd be hard pressed to distinguish one so-called race from another. So race is a false construct that was created by racists in order to separate people into divisions based on color. And racists then assign people with the least amount of humanity, culture, intelligence, and spirituality to people who had the greatest amount of melanin in their skin. In other words, the darker you were, the more primitive you were, the lighter you were, the more sophisticated and closer to God you were. These are all lies. And these are lies that have run the world for the past 2,000 years. And we're about to enter a shift of consciousness where these old lies are literally falling apart right in front of our very eyes. And they're being replaced by truths, not new truths, but old truths, which are finally beginning to surface again. And those, people such as yourself and myself, people who are inquisitive, people who read, people who travel, we're now responsible for making these truths available to a larger audience so that people can begin to decide whether they want to be free or whether they want to be controlled by people who have never shown to have their best interests at heart.
Speaking of that, who was the first genius in the world?
Well, I appreciate you asking me questions that you already know the answer to. Based on the trip to Egypt you made with me 2 months ago, we took you to Saqqara, where we showed everyone in our group the physical evidence of the first genius ever recorded in human history. That physical evidence was the step pyramid, which was designed by Imhotep, who was the prime minister to the king Zoser. Imhotep is regarded in history as the world's first multi-genius. He was an architect, an engineer, astronomer, prime minister to the king Zoser, the prime minister, not just a minister, but the number one minister. He was a philosopher, the poet who was responsible for writing the statement, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die." That statement is attributed to Imhotep. And Imhotep is also regarded in the medical profession as the world's first physician. And he lived almost 3,000 years before Hippocrates, the so-called Greek father of medicine.
Why aren't we taught this in school?
We aren't taught this information because people are controlled by fear and ignorance. The educational systems which were established in order to train people to work for capitalistic industrialists. Our bodies were used to make money for wealthy people to keep them eternally wealthy. And so if people knew that there is no death, that you came back, if people knew that everyone has the capacity to become a genius like Imhotep, that everyone has the capacity to create their own businesses, to employ themselves, to employ their family members, to employ people in their community, it would upset the capitalistic system that has been in place for thousands of years. And so in order for this system to maintain itself, it had to create an institution that would dumb people down such that they would be no good to themselves, but good enough to the capitalists who run the nations that control the world. And that's really what it boils down to.
Thank you. I forget the name of the building or the structure that we went to on the hieroglyphs where they actually scrubbed off the skin color of the original Egyptians.
Okay, so a couple of things I need to say about this. And again, context is everything. And I speak from my own personal experiences. I've been to Egypt 66 times over the past 43 years. My organization has been excavating tombs in Egypt for the past 14 years. So I know a lot about what I'm talking about. And, there is a great deal of misinformation about the history of Kemet, about people's efforts to obscure the history of Kemet. And one of the errors that I hear quite often is that people have changed the skin color of some of the scenes of the ancient Egyptians. Now, while there have been some instances where that has been done in modern times, what I know from my own personal experiences is that when you're working on an excavation and you're restoring or conserving a temple or a tomb, what you're looking at is the restoration of structures that are 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years old. And what conservators do is clean these objects. And so if you take a picture, let's just say if you take a picture of Ramesses II in the Hypostyle Hall of Karnak Temple, if you were to take a photograph of an image of Ramesses from 100 years ago, you would see a different color of that same person than you would today after that image has been cleaned and restored. So because the image may be lighter in tone doesn't necessarily mean, one, that someone intentionally lightened it to camouflage that person's ethnicity. And the other issue is that many of the skin tones that we see of personalities in Kemet, those skin tones are symbolic. They're not literal. So you see men with red skin, you see women with yellow skin, you see some people with brown skin. And so many times these colors are symbolic, but if you don't know the symbolism associated with them, then you'll misinterpret what's there. And that's not to ignore the fact that there have been people throughout the centuries who have intentionally disfigured images, knocked off noses, knocked off lips, knocked off heads in order to camouflage the African features of kings, queens, and other personalities who ruled an African nation. So we're dealing with mind games. The idea that Egypt is in the Middle East is a mind game. Where is the Middle East? If Egypt is in the Middle East, where's the Middle West? Where's the Middle North? Where's the Middle South? That was a term that was created by an American reporter in the early 20th century, and that was used for geopolitical purposes to move Egypt out of Africa. Why? Because if Africans were soulless creatures, according to Pope Eugenius IV, Africans didn't have a soul, and that was the reason why he wrote a papal bull allowing the Portuguese, then the French, and then other European Christians to come in and steal Africans, rape Africans, kill Africans because they had no souls. So people have falsified the historical record in order to justify heinous acts that, again, using Dick Gregory's term, would make Adolf Hitler look like Santa Claus. I've had this thought, and I've got a lot of thoughts for different projects I like to work on. But I had this idea of writing a history of George Washington and title it America's Hitler. Because if you think about what George Washington did in helping to found the United States of America, which was not a democracy, it was a slaveocracy. It was a government that was built on slavery. It is written into the Constitution. They literally had to add amendments to the Constitution to ban slavery and to give enslaved Africans freedom. So this country was founded on the death, sale, and murder of tens of millions of African people. It is a crime that is worse than the crimes that were committed by Adolf Hitler during the 13 years of the Nazi Holocaust. So context is everything. And there are people who want to suppress this historical information because it portrays them or their ancestors in an unfavorable light. And I can understand someone wanting to hide certain information, but we live in a society now where nothing can be hidden. Everything comes to light. And the best thing that we can do is to be honest and truthful and to build a new world, build a new society on a foundation of truth as opposed to lies.
Yeah, I was shocked to find out that the first slavery boat was named Jesus. Is that correct?
The good ship Jesus, absolutely.
Wow.
And as Alex Haley, back in 1976, when he was doing his promotional tour for his book Roots, Alex Haley found in research that he had done in the UK to search the ship's logs of the slave ships that traveled from England to the west coast of Africa to the Americas. He said that when these enslavers loaded their African cargo onto the slave ships, they would make sure that the first two people listed in the ship's log were a man. Ah, you see Kemet
Yeah,
behind
I
me.
was
There she
laughing.
is. Tasha, Tasha. So she always joins me when I'm doing these presentations. Um, Whenever these slave ship captains were loading Africans onto the slave ship, they would they would make sure that the first two people loaded on the slave ship were a man and a woman who were listed in the ship's log as Adam and Eve. Then every other African on the ship was numbered 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they also had the practice of um, having those slave ships leave the slave dungeons on the west coast of Africa on a Sunday. Why a Sunday? Well, because it was their belief as Christians that if they departed these African ports on a Sunday, then God would bless their 2 to 3 month journey across the Atlantic Ocean and ensure their safe arrival and the survival of their human cargo so that they could turn a profit and then come back and steal more Africans. So this happened from 1444 until 1888. And based on numbers that were compiled by W.B. Du Bois, over 50 million African men, women, and children lost their lives. It doesn't take into account the numbers that died during the Middle Passage on the ships as they moved from West Africa to the east coast of North America, Central America, South America, and every island in the Caribbean. Those bodies were thrown overboard and fed to the sharks. It doesn't take into account the Africans who died being marched from their homeland to the shore where they were imprisoned in the slave dungeons. There's 138 slave dungeons that dot the coast of West Africa between Senegal and Cameroon. Most of those slave dungeons, over 80% of those slave dungeons, are in Ghana because Ghana sits at the edge of a trench and has the deepest ports in West Africa. So the enslavement of African people, the enslavement of my ancestors was a business. We were the world's first human commodity. And this story needs to be told in a larger historical context, not to point the finger of blame at white folk because of what their ancestors did, but just so that we can get an understanding of how we got to America, get an understanding of these systems of racism and oppression that were designed to enslave my ancestors in the New World after colonizers and discoverers came and stole the land of your ancestors, obliterated them so that they could create a new world that benefited people of European ancestry. That's the nature of the environment in which we live. And if we aren't free to talk about these historical realities, then there is no such thing as freedom.
What's that George Orwell quote? Those who control the past control the future, and those who control the future control the past.
Mm-hmm. Which means that the present moment is the most important time in history because you determine the past and the future based on what you share with people today. So history, knowledge is a very powerful thing and is far too dangerous to leave in the hands of enslavers, conquerors, or destroyers of civilization.
Thank you. Yeah, we're running out of time, so I wanted to touch on the Egypt on the Potomac. Maybe you do a tour that I would hopefully get to go to one day.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, let me give you the proper language. We refer to it as a field trip and not a tour. The philosophy
Thank
of
you.
Egypt on the Potomac is that we cannot afford, Black people specifically, cannot afford to come to DC as tourists. I say that because this activity, this field trip, is something that I created in 1986 after having returned to Washington, D.C., where I now live, after having returned from my second trip to Egypt in 1985. And I began to notice a plethora of Egyptian symbols in landscape, around DC, in the architecture of DC. And I knew, based on my background in design and architecture, I knew that that wasn't an accident. So I began researching the layout and design of Washington, D.C. And the Egypt on the Potomac field trip is the outgrowth of that research. And it's an activity that I created 37 years ago. And it's still going strong. I can't tell you the number of lives that we have transformed as a matter of people taking this field trip and then realizing that the essence, the architectural, symbolic, spiritual, and mythological essence of Kemet has been used as a black print to create Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the wealthiest, the most powerful nation in human history. And to reinforce that fact, the tallest object in D.C. is an object known as the Washington Monument. For those of us who know the history of Kemet, we know that that obelisk is actually a Tekken, and that Tekken represents the resurrection of Asar. Asar is the founding father of ancient Kemet, and that Tekken represents the oldest symbol of resurrection known to mankind. It is over 6,000 years old, at least 4,000 years older than this other person who was resurrected.
And that Tekken is right in the center of the Vatican as well, right?
There is a Tekken in the center of St. Peter's Square. There are over 10 Tekkenu in Rome. There are more Tekkenu in Rome today than there are in Egypt, and many of them stand in front of churches. And again, as I referenced earlier, the Tekken is the oldest symbol of resurrection known to mankind. It is the story of the resurrection of Asar, right? And Asar became, in Christian language, Asar became Christ because he was resurrected thousands of years before Christ was resurrected. And so what you see, and I've been to Rome several times documenting the African presence in Rome, and what you will notice at the top of every Tekken, in front of every church in Rome, there is a cross. And what that cross symbolizes is the Roman Catholic Church conquering the pagan religions of Egypt or Africa.
Wow, thank you. Any last words?
Well, my last words are the same as my first words. Keep learning, keep reading, free your mind, because nobody else will free your mind for you. Read, study, and share what you've read and study with like-minded souls. This information will not resonate with everybody because not everybody is capable of understanding or tolerating the truth. And accept the fact that people are exactly where they want to be. So I don't have the right to impose my thinking, my beliefs on others. I don't do that. I did it when I was younger, but I know better now. People are where they want to be, and I choose to spend the rest of my life working with people who want to be more than what they are. And we can become more by understanding who we are, what dwells within us, so that we can cultivate that knowledge, cultivate that God force within us, so that we truly can be creators and create a world which sustains us, our family, and the planet.
That's what I love and respect about you, Tony. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on.
It's my pleasure, brother, and I look forward to joining you sometime in the near future.
Sounds good. Thank you. Take care.
All right. You're
Bye-bye.
welcome, my brother. Take